I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar, Canada-Mexico, Overcoming Mistrust to a Critical Agenda.
Thank you very much, Marta, and thank you for all who are attending today and those who will be watching this later on our YouTube channel. We think this panel is particularly important at this moment. The relationship between Mexico and Canada will be severely tested over the coming months as both countries confront new realities vis-a-vis the United States and the evolving world paradigms. The public pronouncements of fraternity and respect between the two countries are not evidenced, however, by many public displays of affection. And in fact, the reality discussed sotto voce in Ottawa and Mexico City is that Mexico and Canada have deep trust issues. Today, we want to discuss those issues, the implications, and how they might be superseded to try and find a critical agenda between the two countries. So to start us off, I'd like to ask Graeme Clark to talk a little bit about it from, as we might say, the Canadian perspective. Thanks, Graeme.
Thank you, Ken. And let me look specifically at the past 12 months of the bilateral relationship, because I think that's illustrative of that lack of trust that you spoke to. And 4 issues or 4 events that I'd like to bring forward. The first is Canada's decision to reimpose a partial visa on Mexico last February, at a timing which the Mexicans found problematic because it was the beginning of their election campaign. And from the Canadian perspective, a decision that had to be taken despite all the messages that had been telegraphed to the Mexican administration in the lead up to the decision to impose that partial visa, saying, please take us in earnest, please take us seriously. So there you have an instance of a failure to communicate for whatever reason on both sides. The second thing would be the judicial reform that the previous Mexican administration brought in, which would see essentially the election of all or most judges in the Mexican judiciary via an electoral process, the details of which have yet to be worked out, and the consequences of which, at least to my mind, to that of many members of the Canadian private sector, are highly problematic. And as you know, that's going forward under the subsequent administration. I made public comments to that regarding that reform that did not go down well, but I felt that it was my responsibility as Canadian ambassador to say something about this disastrous initiative. The third thing I would point to is the inauguration of President Sheinbaum and the fact that we were unable as a government, as Canada, to find anybody of significant level to attend this inauguration. And I think that's a failure of understanding of Mexican political culture on our part. And the fourth element in the mix, at the very end of my time, is the public comments by Premier Ford and by Deputy Prime Minister Freeland and others, which essentially were throwing Mexico under the bus in terms of any future CUSMA negotiation, basically saying, let's go it alone with the U.S. and let's forget about Mexico. I think, so that combination of those 4 elements, I think, and there are others that can be brought forward, demonstrate, at the very least, a lack of understanding or a lack of trust between the two administrations in the two countries.
It's a great way to start. Thanks, Graeme. Juan José.
Thank you, Ken. Very useful how Graeme put it. And and I agree with him at that level, but let me go one more structural level, if I may, where I think all the distrust or the causes of distrust lie. I don't think distrust comes from events between the two countries. I think distrust comes from very structural factors that we tend not to see. We like to believe that Canada and Mexico are neighbors, and natural partners. But we are not. We are very far from each other. Yes, we are in North America, but we have a little neighbor in between. And we have far more, or I put it differently, and the cultural ties, the historical ties, the social ties between the two countries are minimal. Canada is far closer to the US or to Europe than to Mexico. And Mexico has far more commonalities with the US itself and also with certain parts of Europe than with Canada. So we share very little. And this has, or this takes us to the fact, therefore, that the Mexico-Canada relation is always secondary to the one we have with the US. Not only secondary, but in many ways, it's just an accessory of the one we have with the US. I don't want to say, or I don't mean to say that it's not an important relation. It's a critical relation, should be crucial relation, should be strategic. But what there is in between the two is tons of natural forces that, instead of binding us together, pushes us apart. And when the US becomes confrontational, hostile, these natural forces kick in, and each country looks at its own interest vis-a-vis the US. What is new today, which is strengthening or deepening this distrust, is that, unlike in the past, the hostility from the US is not only also to Canada, but very much towards Canada. And that is changing the whole environment. So, but my point is, the distrust is very structural for all these geographical, social, political things. And then, I'm sorry to say it, but there is another level of distrust, or the origin of distrust, which is, and I say this with respect, but in Canada, there are still enormous stereotypes of Mexico or about Mexico, not positive ones. And there's still some genes, political genes in the political system of Canada that intuitively tends to believe that North America ends in the Rio Grande, that Mexico is some sort of a weird addition. And all these two things together are what cause things like those said by Ford and others. What said Ford, what Chrystia Freeland recently with events is not new. They have always said it. Different people, different actors at different points in time. But again, it's not because of events, specific events, but because of all these structural factors. These events just brings this to the surface. I conclude by saying, can this be overcome? Absolutely, and we'll discuss how.
Great, thank you, Juan José. Well, Arturo, you're a keen observer of everything in North America. You've written extensively about the topic we're talking about today in an article in El Financiero only a few months ago. It seems to me very quickly we have a bit of a paradigm, competing paradigms. And though Graeme will come back and respond to it, Graeme's tended to be more on events and situations. Juan José seems to be, well, more than seems to, is talking, as he said, structural. Do you see it in those terms? Do you come out one side or the other, or is it a combination of a lot of things?
Yeah, thank you. And it's a pleasure to join you and my esteemed colleagues here for this, I think, very relevant, very prescient conversation, given the dynamics that we're going to see in play in the North American region in the coming months and years, as was evident. The review process of USMCA is probably going to be jump-started much earlier than the original July 2026 date because of how Trump sees what he wants to do with the free trade agreement that binds the three of us together. I'm not being sort of I'm not trying to have my cake and eat it too, but I think both Graeme and Juan José it's a combination of both things. There are structural reasons why this relationship has always been testy, complex, but there are also events, specific events, milestones over the past 20, 30 years that have turbocharged the structural challenges in our relationship. And full disclosure, I never served in Canada, but as Mexican ambassador to the U.S., as head of policy planning in the Mexican Foreign Ministry, the North American portfolio was always a very important part of my outlook for U.S. foreign policy and for North American foreign policy, which is something that I believe in, and we can talk about this in a bit. But the challenge that we both have is that we live next to an elephant. But as I used to joke with my two Canadian colleagues in the US, first Mike Wilson, who, as most of you know, passed away sadly several years ago, and Gary Doer, who was the next Canadian ambassador. When Gary and I were on the road on Capitol Hill in the US, lobbying for Canada and Mexico's accession to TPP, I would joke that we had one thing in common, that we both lived next to an elephant, but it was much better to be on top of the elephant than underneath the elephant. But what I'm trying to get at here is that at the end of the day, it's Canada's relationship with the US and Mexico's relationship with the US, which is always going to take precedence over the trilateralization of the agenda, because of how strong our respective bilateral ties to Washington, to the US, our trade relationship. Mexico, number one trading partner of the United States, Canada, number two trading partner of the United States, and the political, economic, even societal dynamics. You go to the US-Canada border, you go to the Mexico-US border, and the societal dynamics there, where we really have sort of two additional countries, one along the Canadian-US border and another one along the Mexican-US border, really make this relationship unique. So whenever push comes to shove, Mexico City and Ottawa will always pivot to their bilateral relationship with the US. So yes, absolutely, what Juan José has described is sort of a structural dynamic that is very hard to change and to modify. But at the same time, specific events, specific moments have also made this relationship complex. And Graeme was sort of referring to, this visa decision. You might recall, Graeme, I don't think you were in the mix at the time, but when I was ambassador in Washington, your Canadian colleague in Mexico was trying to convey that same type of messaging the first time that Canada decided to impose visas on Mexicans. And the Mexican government was sort of tone deaf, blind deaf. They just weren't processing what Canada was trying to tell them. And so I get Mike Wilson coming to see me from one end of Pennsylvania Avenue to the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, where our two embassies stand. And he said, Arturo, I've been instructed by Ottawa to come and tell you to see if you can get this message across in Mexico City, because they're simply not understanding what we're trying to tell them. And even though I communicated the message that, guys, we're getting a clear message that this is incoming, the Mexican government did zilch to try and nip the bud before this blew up into a real crisis. Another example, you were talking about throwing Mexico into the bus. And that I think is a very interesting piece of the equation, because there is, and I think it's not only an issue of perceptions. I think there's some real reasons behind this. Mexicans, and I'm one of them, tend to believe that when push does come to shove, when our respective bilateral relationships with the US come into play, Canada is much more inclined to throw Mexico under the bus than Mexico throwing Canada under the bus. And I'll give you a couple of examples. The first one is, since the aftermath of 9/11, when Canada and Mexico very quickly realized that if we didn't up the ante in terms of border security protocols with the United States to ensure, you will all remember that in the immediate aftermath of the terrorist attacks, there was this urban myth percolating for the first few days in the US that the terrorists had crossed from Canada into the United States. And so we very quickly figured out, both of us, that we needed to engage the US differently when it came to perceptions of border security. And from that moment onwards, this term of the Mexicanization of US-Canada relations coming from the private sector, from the government in Ottawa, sort of became a bit of a mantra. I heard a former prime minister in the Oval Office during one of the North American Leaders Summit basically telling both Felipe Calderón and Barack Obama, we don't want to be Mexicanized in our relationship with the United States. And there were also a couple of examples. You were mentioning what happened with the premiers in the immediate aftermath of Trump's win in November. But it's not the first time it happened. And in fact, when we were renegotiating NAFTA into USMCA, there was a point, and you will remember this, Graeme and Juan José, you were
Ottawa.
already in Ottawa at the time, when Trump basically told the Mexican government, screw the Canadians, let's negotiate a bilateral deal, Mexico and the United States, because Canada is not coming to the table and they don't want to agree to what we want to agree. And the Mexican government basically said, no, we're not gonna stab Canada in the back. And so in the minds of those Mexicans who follow the relationship with Canada, of government officials who are invested in the US-Canada, in the Mexico-Canada relationship, there's a stark contrast between what happened, for example, in November, December of last year with Deputy Prime Minister Freeland, with Premier Ford, with the Premier of Alberta saying what they said, and when Mexico had the opportunity to sort of secure USMCA, free trade in North America, by letting the Canadians go, and the Mexican government's position was, no way, we're not going to stab the Canadians. And so those contrasts also make some of the dynamics that you faced during your term as ambassador, and particularly sort of these events that you were narrating, Graeme, make it a bit more complex in terms of how Mexicans react to some of the things that have happened recently in the bilateral relationship.
I want to, Graeme, I'm sure respond to a lot. I just one footnote to what you said, Arturo, is I remember the end of the last NAFTA round was Canada getting a call saying from, I think it was Jared Kushner, to the Canadian ambassador, saying, well, we've already cut our deal with Mexico. Canada, do you want to come in or not? So doesn't that run a bit counter to a bit of that narrative that you talked about in terms of?
Oh, because the Jared Kushner and Lighthizer were trying to use, we've wrapped up the deal with the Mexicans, as a way to pressure Canada, and that was the messaging that was going from Washington to Ottawa. But Mexico's position was, we're not going to sign. In fact, Trump had invited the finance minister and the trade minister of Mexico to the White House. He almost ambushed them with the idea of saying, okay, we're signing the deal, and they both backed off and said, we're not going to do this without the Canadians.
Okay, thanks, Graeme.
Can I respond on the visa issue, because I think it's a really interesting issue of minds not being met between the two countries, right? And Arturo, I find it fascinating that you were in the same situation of having to try to convince your own administration of the seriousness of our démarche in the previous decision under the Harper administration, the Harper government, to reimpose a visa. You know, I guess my question to both Juan José and Ambassador Sarukhan is, what could we on the Canadian side have done better to convince the Mexican side that we were in earnest when we said we have a problem on visas? There are too many Mexicans who are taking advantage of the vulnerabilities in our system, and if that isn't corrected, we will have to reimpose a visa. What could we have done? Or is there nothing that we could have done? Was it just sort of inevitable that something like this would happen? Because I do think that this issue of human mobility is key as we go forward in terms of the bilateral relationship.
Yeah, on this, my own recollection, or more than recollection, participation on the visa thing. I spent 3.5 years in Ottawa with this issue of the visa on my desk and discussing every now and then, very often, with the Canadian authorities and with the Mexican authorities. My reading is the following. First, I frankly disagree that the Mexican authorities didn't hear, didn't understand, or didn't want to act upon it. I think we understood very clearly.
Just 1 second. Sorry for interrupting. I think for the clarity of those who are listening in, we just have to.
You were before.
That we're talking about two very different moments. That sort of, there's an original visa decision back in 2007, 2008, and then there's this latest one, which is the one that you're referring to.
Absolutely. I think on the Mexican side, well, first, what was the problem? The problem was, and I said it publicly, privately, in Twitter, in Canadian news interviews, etc., was recognizing that certain segments of the Mexican society were abusing the Canadian immigration system. There's no doubt about it. There were planes arriving, landing here and there all the time in Canada, where not a small percentage of Mexicans, as soon as they were off the plane, they claimed asylum. But what we discussed, and we recognize this, but what we discussed with Canada was that whatever Mexico could do on the Mexican side, it was very difficult to persuade people not to try. How do you convince people all over the country that they shouldn't try to do this? So we always said to our Canadian friends, first, let's work on all the instruments, all the tools that are at the disposal of these people that honestly are abusing the system. Okay, tool number one, which was the Canadian view, we have to make public, publicize, educate. Okay, and that's where Mexico didn't do enough. We could have publicized more. Don't abuse the system. Go to the Canadian embassy, check the web. You need a visa. Don't use the asylum. It's going to be worse for you, etc. Okay, I think we absolutely fell short on that. But there were other structural issues where Canada didn't want to act either. Intermediaries, lawyers, agents in Mexico and on the Canadian side that were facilitating all this illegitimate movement of people. Companies, I'm sorry, Graeme, but Canadian companies that had their discrete means to bring people from Mexico without the proper papers. Having shady firms, human resources or immigration lawyers that would do the paperwork and then discreetly would say to the person involved, but when you come, you just say that you are claiming for asylum. That was a problem. And there I insisted to the Canadian authorities, why don't you need to do something there? Zero, because the law, privacy, legislation, etc. There was a point, I don't know if you go to say all these things now, but I say this with a lot of respect, and I will go to less details, but sometimes we had cases of a case of an undocumented Mexican, for example, that was operating a massive crane on a massive infrastructure project in the center of Ottawa, and no papers. No? So there was, to go around all this more than necessary, far more challenging structural issues on Mexico and absolutely on Canada. And we always said to the Canadians, please also do your homework over there. Also improve your system, also expedite it, also reduce backlogs, also tackle all these so-called lawyers, also check on your companies. Let's kill it, because by what Canada wanted was just to stop them. How can we stop people? It was extremely difficult. And then I think, if I also may say, as I always said to my Canadian friends in government, in parliament, because it was a permanent issue, is that Canada understood very well that the visa imposition on Mexicans was not just an immigration document, but unavoidably a political message, intendedly or not, or unintendedly. And I always told them, careful. With a visa, you are not going to solve the problem, but you are going to create another one. And I believe, modestly, that the reason for imposing the visa on Mexico was not only because the problem was manageable or unmanageable. It was very much a internal politics decision. I understand that's the way reality is. But it was also that. It's not just that Mexico was deaf. Mexico didn't hear, and Canada had no other choice but to. And let
Well,
me
Jose,
go.
let me just
Yes.
interrupt 1 second, because I don't want to bring in Arturo and Graeme. But when you said intentional political decision, I think what you're implying is there was a message that the Canadian government wanted to send at a higher level, at a more important level, and was using the visa as a way of
No,
sending
what
that.
I'm saying
Or they
is
just,
that
are you
no,
saying
what
that
I'm
Ottawa was
saying,
just blind to that?
what I'm saying is that you need to be aware that if you do this, in Mexico will not be seen, never ever, just as an administrative tool to solve an immigration problem. It will be seen, it will be read as a political message, because visas are not just administrative papers, but political messages too. And also because of the inefficiency of the visa itself. But quickly, and I finish. Back to what Arturo was discussing, again on the structural things. We have different readings of the situation depending where we were serving, but I fundamentally agree with both, with Graeme and Arturo on different moments. And I agree that all these moments add to the complexities. It's not that we have separate views on that. Mine is the structural, theirs is the event, both absolutely belong to the same. But let me insist on another structural thing. Why this thing of who's throwing under the bus who? For Mexico, strategically, it always made more sense the trilateralization of the agenda.
Yep.
For Canada, it never made sense, the trilateralization of the agenda. For Canada, still today, is far more important to keep it bilateral because we have different historical experiences regarding the US, and we have different interests vis-a-vis the US. So for Canada, bilateralizing the agenda, it was critical. Trilateralizing would weaken the bilateral agenda, whereas for Mexico, it was very strategic to keep it trilateral. Probably Graeme is going to disagree with this, but I am absolutely convinced of this reality. And let's say, I will not speak for Canada. I will speak for Mexico. For Mexico, strategically, always, since NAFTA and before, it made a lot of sense, all the sense, to trilateralize and keep Canada in the game.
But today, nobody speaks about North America today. Nobody is speaking of the trilateral dynamic.
Today.
No,
Today
no Mexican, no American, no Canadian.
No, I agree.
The North American agenda is, in hibernation.
Well, I've been banging my drum about a North American agenda for eons, and I continue to do it, Graeme. But I completely concur with. But I want to go back to the visa, the question that you posited regarding the visa issue, at least during visa 1.0 and not visa 2.0. Absolutely, for Mexico, trilateralizing relations in North America has always been seen as a strategic objective. Obviously, because by trilateralizing, you dilute the pressures that, because of the power asymmetry between Mexico and the United States, there's a power asymmetry between Canada and the US, but it's not as big or as deep or as structural as one that exists between Mexico and the US. because of that trilateralization, we diminish that power asymmetry, whether it's on trade, whether it's on post 9/11 border security, whether it's on trade issues, etc. So absolutely, that has always been the name of the game in Mexico City. But going back very quickly to the Visa 1.0 moment, it was a combination of things, Graeme. Number one is you guys in Mexico chose the wrong messenger. You didn't go to the SRE, to the foreign ministry. You decided to go elsewhere. I won't say where, because if anyone has a bit of historical memory or bureaucratic memory, you can figure it out quickly. But you didn't go through SRE, you went through somewhere else. And that individual is not the correct individual to get the message across. And you thought that that was the correct messenger. And by the time sort of I get Michael's visit, the dynamic is already contaminated because of the second reason why the Mexican government was unable to read the tea leaves, which was that, as in most things in life, people are policy. And there was, if Obama and Harper's relationship was bad, Calderon and Harper's relationship was even worse. And so Calderon saw this as a way of Harper sort of scoring political points. And that made the whole decision-making process in Mexico City much more complex. So I think that in Visa 1.0, it was a combination of a bad choice by Canada or by Canadian authorities on the ground in Mexico City as to who to communicate the messages, and second, the personal dynamics between the two leaders at the time.
So if we can just finish on visas, I'm sorry, this is my fault, but on Visa 2.0, the then Prime Minister wanted to discuss this issue with President López Obrador. President López Obrador refused to take the Prime Minister's call, knowing what it was about, either to announce the decision or to have some sort of discussion around it. And, for me, that's emblematic. The fact that a Mexican president won't speak to a Canadian Prime Minister on a key issue, no matter what the sins of the situation are, and I'll agree with a lot of what Juan José said, it's still not acceptable between two partner countries to not be able to discuss these things because one doesn't want to talk about it. Right?
I couldn't agree with you more. The diplomatic vandalism that we saw with López Obrador and the finger that he gave to foreign policy all the time, the fact that he never, ever during his 6 years traveled to Canada to meet with one of his main trading partners is piece and parcel to what we're discussing here.
Yeah, agreed.
So, Graeme,
sorry, Ken.
No, not at all. Let me ask a question about that, Graeme. Is the fact that AMLO didn't take the call, why do you think that was? And do you think that part of that was on advice of the, quote, bureaucracy? Because I want to segue to entrenched, perhaps, I think we're talking about some entrenched views in Ottawa and Mexico in the bureaucracy on beyond the head of state. You want to talk about what your view of that is?
In fairness to the bureaucracy, I think they were trying to facilitate that call. I was in touch throughout the entire weekend with the head of the North American unit, and he was in touch with his foreign minister, and they were both pushing. And I think at the end of the day, the president thought, if I don't have this conversation, this isn't going to happen, right? I mean, I think it's as simple as that. Somebody's not going to tell me bad news, therefore that bad news isn't going to exist in the world of reality. I think that's what happened. And at the end of the day, your humble servant here was instructed to go and tell the Mexican foreign minister that this was happening. Not the easiest task for any ambassador to provide this sort of news.
I think the explanation is even more simple. President López Obrador didn't talk to anybody. I'm sorry, it was not because it was Canada.
I
he only talked to the US president.
I didn't say it was Canada. I said it was general.
No, exactly. No, my point is I think it was a mistake. I think I'm not so sure if the visa thing would have been averted or not after that phone call, but I agree it should have taken place. But President López Obrador simply didn't talk to any other leader. It was his style, good, bad. It was his style. And finally, the structure of the Mexican administration. Still today, maybe things are very challenging today, but there is a lot of effort willing to work with Canada. I can tell you that. I mean, that I have no doubt whatsoever. That's why I insist so much on the structural challenges that cause all these misunderstandings, etc. But there's a will.
Just a question, and we don't want to dwell too much on the visa, though. It does seem to be a bit of a microcosm. It seems an issue that can come at as a way of saying, okay, well, this. But, you know, I remember not that long ago, that maybe a decade, where Canada also imposed visas in other countries, including Chile, right? So you go into the airport in Santiago, and there would be the line for extranjeros and Chilenos, and the separate line for Canadians. Almost had I think a skull and crossbones on it, whatever. Chileans were upset, and you'd had to pay $100 to get in to Chile if you were traveling in on your Canadian passport. Well, okay, Canada and Chile have certainly since the 70s developed a very, very strong relationship. That was an irritant in the relationship, but it didn't become what we're talking about now between Canada and Mexico. So I guess the question is, why is that become a focal point and such an irritant when in fact in other situations for Canada in Latin America it wasn't? You have
Can I say, please, Graeme, go first.
No, go ahead, Juan Jose.
No, I was going to say that if this was Mexico and I don't know, Sweden, Denmark, it would be the same. The reason why on Mexico it became a big irritant is because the Mexico-Canadian relation, despite all its challenges, is a relationship of enormous significance for both. And significance creates complexity. So you tell me, whatever you tell me of Canada, Chile, I'm sure it's true and even better. But again, I use the example Mexico-Sweden, absolutely true. They are beautiful, perfect, everything is manageable because they lack significance. And I don't mean this as a negative. They are strong, cooperation goes back and forth, there are cultural exchanges, some trade, some investment, etc., etc., etc. Fine. Canada, Mexico is complex because of the US, because the North America equation, because of NAFTA, because we mean 1.5 trillion US dollars every a year of trade, etc., etc., etc. That's why it matters so much. That's why it's so complex and why all these things come.
I completely agree with Juan Jose. I would just put some figures on his theoretical framework, which is, you know, you've got close to 3 million Canadian tourists coming to Mexico every year. We're the second largest source country of tourism. Do you really want to slap a visa on Canadians and send them all off to the Dominican Republic or Cuba when they could be, you know, basting themselves on the beaches of Cancun? No, you don't. So, I mean, I'm less theoretical and philosophical than Juan Jose, but he's right. It's a big relationship, and that's why the visa situation has evolved the way it has.
Arturo, did you want to jump in?
And by the way, a huge apology. There's some construction work going on next door, and
we can't hear it, so don't worry about it.
You can hear the hammer, but let me sort of all of this is crucially important, but let me piggyback on the whole visa issue and piggyback on Graeme's assertion, which I think is generally true about the lack of a North American discussion and North American debate, which is we have a huge opportunity to hopefully turbocharge North American relations and Mexico-Canada relations because we have a North American World Cup in 2026. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about soccer, which is my passion. But even though I was
talk all day about that, Arturo.
I was the one who came up with the idea of a full disclosure here, Graeme. My proposal was for a U.S.-Mexico World Cup, but in my last North American Leader Summit with Barack Obama, and because of the complex dynamics of his relationship with PM Harper, he was waiting for him to arrive in the White House and said, God, what topic should we put on the table, which is fuzzy, warm, which can allow us to have a good conversation? And I said, well, I've been discussing the idea with the federations of Mexico and the US of having a joint World Cup in 2026. Why don't you propose that we do a North American World Cup for 2026? Lo and behold, that became the genesis of what we have now next year. But I bring all of this up because we have global entry with the United States. You have nexus with the United States. But we don't have a trusted traveler program for North Americans. It should be easy pickings to really transform our respective bilateral trusted traveler programs into one true North American trusted traveler program, which would eliminate this whole, thing of the visa recurrence coming up every decade in the relationship between Mexico and Canada. We need to have a North American trusted traveler program, which allows fans of the three countries during the World Cup to travel in an expeditious manner between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. What I'm trying to suggest here is that World Cup, on a number of fronts, whether it's on a trust or a North American trusted traveler program, whether it's on how do we design a true public diplomacy strategy for the three North American countries to jointly conduct in our own respective countries, so that we send a message to Canadians, Americans, and Mexicans as to why this trilateral relationship is so important for each nation, but also communicate to the rest of the world why North America is such an important architectural construct in a very fluid and volatile global system. And so, you at the beginning, Ken, talked about some of the opportunities going ahead. If we miss this opportunity that we have of piggybacking on the World Cup to really rethink everything from port infrastructure, land crossings and infrastructure, to trusted traveler programs, to joint public diplomacy, to how we explain ourselves to the rest of the world, we will have missed a huge chance. And the problem is, every time I go about with this little speech here, Canadians, Mexican, and US officials nod and say, oh, yes, yes, yes. I've been saying this for the last 3 years, and the fact that we are almost a year away from the ball being before the initial kickoff in Mexico City in June of next year, the fact that we still don't have any movement on any of these issues sort of gives me pause as to the muscle tone and the willingness and the strategic vision of how to use these events that can really sort of propel our relationship forward.
Okay, great. Thank you, Arturo. Look, my rather simplistic question about Chile was, the subtext of that was to elicit what we
Nothing against Chile here.
was the visa was to actually elicit exactly the conversation we had now as we're running this therapy session on intimate partners who have trust issues, which is to say at the end, yes, there's this, there's that, there's structures, events, but we're in an intimate relationship to varying degrees, and it needs to go forward. It's intimate on very, very levels. And so thank you all. We've gotten to that acknowledgement point, which actually, and my rates are only $150 an hour. So we got to this point in the session very quickly.
But very quickly, Ken, just sort of, I don't want people to think that we're just staying at soccer level. Look,
well, we got to get to the points. We got to get to the
again, because of our respective relationships with Washington.
Yeah.
Washington today is immersed in the most important recalibration of its foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, and that's its relationship with China. For that recalibration to be successful in Washington, particularly on the trade and economic front, the US has to bring Canada and Mexico into the equation because of supply chains, because of North American paradigm for energy security, energy resilience, energy independence, energy security, because of essential supply chains, because of this whole debate of sort of reshoring, ally shoring, friend shoring, whatever you want to call it. And we, Canada and Mexico, have a joint task to do in Washington, which is convince this administration, and quite frankly, the previous administration, because the previous administration was equally tone deaf. They would talk the talk, but they wouldn't walk the walk. And Canadians and Mexicans have to go to Washington together in the coming months to do two very important things. One is ensure the survival of USMCA, because the tendency in Washington is going to be to renegotiate USMCA into two bilateral FTAs, one with Canada, one with Mexico. And two, to underscore that if that ongoing strategic recalibration with China is to succeed, it needs Canada and Mexico as part of the architecture.
Okay, fair enough. I guess the question is, we don't know where Washington is really headed. We don't know what capricious decisions will be made, what bumps will be on along the way. We might posit, Arturo, I think you're getting to the point of saying the U.S. is going to somehow realize that it has no alternative. This is the proper way to go. I think you're more or less saying that with a lot of effort of Canada and Mexico. Fair enough. That could be. I guess the question is, holding that aside for a second, what is the strong agenda that Canada and Mexico can develop on their own that's not always vis-a-vis the United States, right? Because that's a bit of the trap that this relationship is in, because as we just talked about, structural and fidelities or infidelities one way or the other. So maybe in the last minutes, and I know.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead. Does that?
I think Juan Jose has the floor.
Yeah,
So
Juan
no,
Jose,
go, Graham.
No. So I'll give you. Go ahead, Juan Jose.
Okay, very quickly. It's very difficult, Ken, to imagine the Canadian-Mexico relation making an abstraction of the U.S. existence. Yes, there are many things we can do, and there are things that are being done. They are not that public or evident, but the critical mass, if you want, between the two countries is not small. There's tons of cooperation on many things. We can strengthen them, we can improve them, we can expand them, but they will always be marginal as compared, or if you compare them or you put them in our unavoidable reality of being in North America next to the US. Now, that said, 2 or 3 very specific points. The North American narrative is dead. And I think it's not paused, I think it's dead as a narrative. However, the integration itself is not dead, and it won't be dead. The Canada and Mexico need to be smart on how to keep pursuing it, because it's a reality that you cannot undo supply chains, etc. Third, those that understand all this better than anybody are companies and the Canadian private sector. The Canadian private sector is very clear on few things. Number one, that despite the politics, Mexico is essential, not only because it's another US or NAFTA or TMEC partner, but because it's an enormous country. I always told my Canadian friends, and many people in Mexico may get angry if I say this, but the Mexican middle class, with all its complexities, contradictions, etc., is as twice the size of the whole Canadian population. And this is something Canadian companies understand it better than anybody else. So the Canadian investment flows continue, trade continues. And there are now fascinating projects, Canadian projects, to connect Mexico-Canada trade more directly, using the US just as a transit point, trying to delink from the US. I think that's extremely interesting. And final point, this is it should be a strategic relationship, and neither of the two countries sees it like that. I think the only thing that should happen and could change a lot is if President Sheinbaum and Prime Minister Mark Carney one of these days talk understand each other, and make the decision. I can assure you that if this talk event conversation happens, not pro forma, a real eye-to-eye conversation between the two, they understand the pros and the value of this strategic relation vis-a-vis the US. That's an unavoidable reality. I'm sure the two countries could multiply its work, its cooperation, and eventually its trust. It's totally possible, but I don't see it coming from under or from the bottom. Has to be them.
Yeah. I completely agree with Juan Jose that it's the tone from the top, right? It's the engagement at the top that is going to change or rebuild or rekindle the trust between the two countries. So I completely agree with you on that, Juan Jose, and I hope that that's being thought of in the different cancillerías and ministries, both in Mexico City and Ottawa. I agree with you, there is no North American agenda at the moment. There's no North American narrative beyond soccer and a few integrative leftovers that are being pursued. Perhaps not even there. And the third point I'd say, Ken, to answer your question very specifically, what are bilateral things that we can do without the US? And I think that on mobility, human mobility issues, there are things we can do.
Yeah.
I think let's try to have another conversation about visas, okay? Let's have a series of serious conversations. If the two leaders say, we must tackle this issue, we must find a way, why not? We'll instruct our bureaucracies to find a way forward on the visa issue. We'll instruct our bureaucracies to broaden the seasonal agricultural workers program to other sectors to provide opportunities for Mexican youth. We'll do in terms of student exchanges. It won't simply be Mexican students coming to Canada, but we'll have Canadian students coming to Mexico to learn about Mexico, because I agree we need confidence building measures between the two countries, and what better way to do it than with our youth?
Mm-hmm.
There's one additional issue, and fair warning, I'm not the multilateralist in this group, but I've always argued that there's one way that we can build muscle tone in the Canada-Mexico relationship, which is via multilateral fora and multilateral issues. One of the reasons why during my 20 plus years in the foreign ministry, I would bang my drum on the importance of Mexico finally jumping on board UN peacekeeping operations. It was because of the ability to work with Canada, a country that has had such an important historical role in PKOs, to deepen the connective tissue between both our countries. So yes, there are a lot of things on the sort of formal bilateral front, whether it's temporary worker, labor mobility, energy issues. Of course, that as long as the current Mexican government does a U-turn on its energy policies. But having said that, it's the multilateral arena where I think there's a lot of potential in sort of deepening and providing strategic depth and more engagement between Canada and Mexico. But the problem again here is what we've sort of referred to, some of us in a much more direct manner, which is the 6 years of legacy with which the current Mexican government has been saddled, which was a government that simply stopped, Mexico usually punched below its weight in the international arena. In the last 6 years with López Obrador, it didn't even get up on the ring. And so, but I think that the multilateral space could provide both countries with some degree of deepening and widening our bilateral agenda.
Okay, we have 4 or 5 more minutes, and so let's pick up on that theme of the multilateral collaboration. One might look at this and saying, well, both countries are going in slightly different directions in terms of their view of democracy and human rights in the hemisphere and elsewhere, right? The recent meeting between Diaz-Canel and Claudia Sheinbaum, et cetera, right? And other areas we could talk about. So I guess the question is, in Canada under Mark Carney has talked again about human rights and democracy. And I'm not always saying Canada walks the walk on everything or walks the talk, but the rhetoric is very different and the actions in multilateral fora seem to be different. So the question is there really a basis for that kind of collaboration on those issues with Canada and Mexico, and to what extent?
On democracy and human rights, no way. No, at least not in the hemisphere. This government will continue to play footsie with particularly Cuba, to a lesser extent Venezuela and Nicaragua, but they will continue to play footsie. Venezuela, because Chavez basically not fully funded, but gave a lot of money to López Obrador's 2006 presidential campaign. So there won't be convergence when it comes to democracy, human rights in the region, but there can be other multilateral issues, Ken, where the Mexican and the Canadian perspectives on global issues, whether it's G20, UN, APEC, where I think there can be a greater opportunity for a conversation, for convergence between Canadian multilateral diplomacy and Mexican multilateral diplomacy.
Juan José, you were.
I agree. Sorry.
Oh, no. Go ahead, Graeme.
No, I was going to say, I agree with Arturo. I agree with Arturo that I think a lot of Canadian officialdom would love to be able to pursue a hemispheric agenda with Mexico, but I agree with Arturo. It's too charged, it's too complex, it's too historically laden, and we should look elsewhere for the foreign policy and multilateral convergences to function between Canada and Mexico. It's not going to be in the hemisphere. Sorry.
Thank you, Graeme. Juan José, in one of your prior positions, you were Mexico's permanent representative to the United Nations. So you've been in the middle of this. We'll give you the last word on this. What might be the grounds for multilateral collaboration?
Listen, I was ambassador to the UN and also ambassador in Geneva, and I have to say that I spent a lot of time working with Canada. But what is more interesting, or most interesting of this, is that, funny enough, one of the best expressions, with all its, again, limitations and challenges and contradictions, but one of the most interesting things of this is that the multilateral arena became one of the best expressions of North America working together. Yes, there were many things where we disagreed. There were many things where Canada and Mexico disagreed with the US. There were many things where Mexico disagreed with Canada and the US. But the communication between us, the friendship as a countries, I'm not, the collective operation, the information, the sharing of ideas, reflections, and doing things together whenever we could was absolutely incredible. The challenge ahead is that we don't know what is going to happen with multilateralism. So there is a huge open question. What is the new US going to do? And what are going to be the effects on the multilateral arena with the US, the new US? So that's to be seen. Mexico and Canada, again, have limitations. We can work on different specific agendas. Sometimes we could on democracy, sometimes on human rights, and some other times we simply didn't or were not able. Why? Because we have fundamental different of views on many things. And that has nothing to do with events and mistrust. It has to do with history. It has to do with the way we see the world, with the way we understand our role in the planet. And that, when you ask those questions, Mexico and Canada are very different because our historical experience and the geography we belong to is different. That said, we work on the Security Council reform, we work on migration, we work on technologies, we work on disarmament. In all now we work on peacekeeping, as Arturo was saying. So on all these stuff, we work together. And I think we can keep working together. The question for the future is going to be, if this working together on different agendas, fair enough, we do it, can really make a difference in the bilateral relationship. That I don't know, because I don't know yet, and I'm not extremely optimistic about how the multilateral scene is going to look like, how the new international order is going to look like, and which role each of us want to have. Canada is a NATO country. It's a fully 100% Western country or Western agenda country. Mexico is far more complex. Mexico is an emerging country with very much a Western agenda, but not everything. We are still a developing country. We still understand other things from other regions. So with all this, despite all this complexity, again, yes, it is possible. But I wouldn't bet in that is going to be the game changer between the two countries. The game changer is Mexico, Canada making a proactive effort to sail against the current, to overcome these negative currents and find the strategic space for both to work together. And again, that's Mark Carney and President Sheinbaum. I don't see it any other way.
I really think that's the best way to end this. Graeme and Arturo, with your permission, we will leave that with Juan Jose having the last word.
Thank you. That's a big responsibility.
All due respect to all three of you. And this, I guess normally therapy sessions go for 50. This has gone for an hour. But this is just the first of it, all right? And we will be very active in this arena, as we will hopefully in getting high-level officials from Mexico coming up to Canada. God knows we've tried and we are trying. With that, thank you very much, gentlemen. I turn it over to Marta to close us out.
Thanks so much, Ken. Thank you, ambassadors. It's a pleasure to have you and a fascinating conversation. I also just want to remind everybody that the recording of this will be up on our YouTube site in all 3 languages later today or by tomorrow. And also to let everyone know to please keep an eye out on our website for future events, as we will be having some series of events on upcoming elections in the region, including with Chile and Colombia. So thank you all again, and look forward to having you again with us at future CCA events. Thanks again, everyone.